This is Wings on the Air.
Welcome to Wings on the Air. I'm Ann Edenfield-Sweet, the Executive Director and founder of Wings for Life International. And today we're going to learn all about ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. We have two wonderful guests with us today, Dr. Roxanne Morris and Beth Dorado. So they are experts, so tell us a little of your background.
Well, I guess I'll start. For me, I work with the Albuquerque Public Schools, and I'm with Title I, and Title I provides resources to our most needy schools based on a poverty index. And so we have a number of schools in the Albuquerque Public School system. I've been a teacher and a principal and have seen the gamut of trauma and struggles in the classroom and in our school system in general.
Okay, and Beth, share a little of your experiences.
Thank you. My name is Beth Dorado, and I'm currently the academic counselor at Gordon Burnell Charter School. Gordon Burnell Charter School serves adult learners, so individuals who never received a high school diploma but are coming back to engage with education and continue their studies. We have multiple campuses around the metro area. Our largest campus, where I spend most of my time, is inside the Metropolitan Detention Center, so inside our county jail. So we work with adults that are incarcerated, adults that are in long-term treatment facilitations. We work with Job Corps students, and then we have a campus here in Albuquerque that's open to the public for any adult who's interested in re-engaging with education.
Wow. So you both, through the public schools and through the school within the jail itself, and then on the outside, you both are dealing with people that have experience with ACEs. Tell us what ACEs are. What are they?
Well, let's start back when ACEs had a study done.
Sure.
And Nadine Burke did a study with Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. And she noticed that there were some similarities and patterns in folks that were coming in to her office. She's a physician. And so they ended up launching a study around some topics that affected our adults and youth population at the point. It was in 1995 that the study was done. From that study then evolved a list of ACE questions. And those questions narrowed down and categorized trauma in adults and children.
And so ACEs are adverse childhood experiences.
Yes.
And I think there are three types of them.
There are three types of ACEs. There are abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And so this collaborative effort between the U.S. Center of Diseases Control and Prevention and Kaiser Permanente really discovered that there's a relationship between childhood stressors and a variety of health and social problems. And so this idea that children who experience abuse, which is the first category, neglect, which is the second category, or household dysfunction, which is the third category, they end up presenting with a range of health and social problems as a possible result or correlation to having those experiences as a child.
So what are some of the common characteristics of people that have these ACEs?
Common characteristics in those three categories of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction are things like a student might have a high rate of diabetes, or a student might have a high rate of suicide, or an adult might have a high rate of suicide, depression, drug use, obsession with things, whether it's an obsession with gathering things or maybe overeating or undereating, those kinds of challenges within the system. Physical and emotional neglect feelings, where a child might be coming within themselves or turning inside out and really isolating themselves and having some isolation patterns, are some characteristics of people that might be experiencing ACEs. Aside from the physical components, you've got some of the mental issues that come along with it.
So I'm still not really clear about ACEs. So tell me about what some of those things are. So maybe it'll make a little more sense to me.
Sure. So what we're really talking about is a traumatic experience. Okay. So children who experience traumatic events, who go through traumatic experiences, that trauma stays with the person. And so a lot of how that works out there's a lot of factors involved. And so it's not just as simple as I experienced something traumatic and therefore I'm going to have these problems. It's not a cause-effect relationship, but there is a high correlation that children who experience trauma in their lives, whether that be physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse, or whether that be some sort of physical or emotional neglect, or whether there's mental illness or incarcerated individuals in the home, or if they witness domestic violence in the home, or if there's substance abuse or even divorce in the home. These are all really difficult situations that many children are facing. And the idea here is those adverse childhood experiences through years, decades of research have consequences. And so people who experience trauma often hold on to that trauma, and if they're not able to work through it, or they're not able to, they don't have some of the protective factors that help them grow after the trauma, then it is often the fact that they experience some of these adverse health experiences as well. So the ACE study was really monumental in providing the research that we needed to understand that when we experience trauma, we carry that trauma. And it could have either physical, mental, or social repercussions later on in life.
So it can happen to children at a very early age, elementary age, high school. I mean, do these ACEs develop over time depending on the circumstances? Tell me more about that.
Well, like any event in our life, they can be cumulative, but they also have different effects on different people. And it's not just for children, and it's not just for adults. We have many adults walking around that have had traumatic experiences and challenges in their life. And they might have reacted one way on one day, and it wouldn't have bothered them. It was just a bump in the road. But then again, there are days where, as you know, things add up. And the trauma in your life stays with you and builds and can be cumulative in how you react. And so I think it's important for us to understand that it can be elementary little kids all the way up to the elderly, and how we experience trauma, how we interpret trauma, and how we react to trauma, and what sort of support systems we have around us as well are critical in how a person or a child really manages and lives through that journey to the other side. Sometimes it's a little rougher than other people, and sometimes you can manage, like I said, one thing, but when you add two more issues on top of one existing traumatic experience, it kind of blows the fuse. And so I think it's important for us to understand that there's not really a recipe. There's not an age limit. There's not an age that it begins and ends. There's not a recipe for, if I mix these two traumatic experiences, this is going to be the end result. It really is, and there's not a prescription. There's not something that I can say to you, Anne, and say, this is what you need to do to fix this. It really is an individual journey, and how you navigate through the pain and the trauma and the physical ramifications of the effects of trauma.
Now, Beth, because you're working with a population within the jail system itself, truly at risk, and probably clientele that have probably several or more of these ACEs, how does that play out in the classroom for you and in the environment that you're in?
I think it's really important to remember that people respond to trauma in very different ways. And as Roxanne was saying, it's not a cookie cutter. There's not a checklist. Oh, if I see someone doing this, this, and this, then they must have experienced some kind of trauma. The reality is trauma is really just over-stimulating our danger response system. So when something is scary, when we get afraid, when we're fearful, we have ways that we cope with that. And a lot of times there's a phrase called a window of tolerance. And so everyone has a different window of tolerance. It's genetic, it's also based on your environment, but some people have a really large window of tolerance. So they can handle a lot of fear, a lot of danger, a lot of uncertainty, and they're able to cope with that. And they don't really have any long-term effects from having been through those experiences. And other people have a much smaller window of tolerance. And so when they're overloaded, their body goes into what some people remember as the fight or flight response. You know, the bear comes at you and you're either going to fight or you're going to run. But years of research has shown us there's really more, there's a variety of ways that people react. Some people do fight. And so you may see people who are aggressive, who are irritable, who are quick to anger. And it may not be in the face of danger. It's just that that's their response. So once we experience trauma, if we can't handle it, if it's outside of our window of tolerance, then we often have some of these symptoms coming up at times when we're not in danger, right? It's a strange thing that our body and that our mind does. And so if we become traumatized through an experience, then regular frustration, not the same danger, not the same physical abuse, not the same sexual abuse or the same dysfunction, but any sort of frustration that pushes me out of my window of tolerance. They actually say that trauma makes your window of tolerance smaller. So the more ACEs that a person might experience, the more traumatic experience that a person might go through. Someone might start off with a fairly large window of tolerance, meaning they can handle a whole bunch of stress. But then as they go through experiences that overstimulate them and overwhelm them, that window begins to shrink. So then anytime I'm frustrated, I can respond with the fight-flight response. If again, the fight is aggression or quick to anger or self-harm, suicidal type stuff. Flight, if you meet students or you have people that distrust you, they have trouble concentrating, they feel trapped, they constantly want to get away. That's how flight can manifest itself in daily life. But it's not just fight or flight. We're also seeing that many people freeze when they're overwhelmed. Rather than fighting or running, they feel stuck. And they internalize and they're hypervigilant. And some people don't fight or flight or freeze, but they submit. Their way of handling an overstimulation of their coping mechanisms is to identify with the perpetrator, is to align with whatever it is that's harming them. And that's another way that you'll see these kind of stress things surfacing is through submit. And then the last one is attachment cry. And this is people who are very dependent, have a sense of emptiness. And so they've broadened that initial fight or flight response to fight, flight, freeze, submit, or attachment cry. And these are all ways that we might recognize that someone is working outside of their window of tolerance. They're no longer able to cope with the stress. They've had past trauma that has shrunk their window of tolerance, and so now they're doing the best that they can to manage the stressors that are on them that society has.
So in the public school system, then you're talking about older students because of jail. Now, in the younger students, what kind of things are you seeing in the classroom that might be typical, and then how does the teacher or the school system handle it? Roxanne, how do you do with that?
Often our schools and our school personnel are trained in trauma-informed practice, is what it's called, so that our staff can not react themselves to the reaction. It's important that our staff does not take on and, if you will, act like the child, right? They need to really react in a very calm, very loving manner. The interesting part is none of these things, the fight, flight, freeze, submit, any of those things are, again, they're not cookie cutters. So you might see a child in your classroom one day that's very, very compliant, that's just loving and super like overly compliant. And the next minute, their window of tolerance went away for a math problem that they couldn't handle, or a recess bell that went really loud, that will flip their switch, and all of a sudden they'll be super aggressive. They'll want to throw a chair across the room, or they'll punch Johnny, their next door neighbor, a little bit. So teachers have to be aware, and administrators need to be aware that all students react differently. All people react differently. It's not just kids, but all people react differently. And all people have different reactions at different times. So just because they are frozen now and walking through the world numb and feeling numb and disconnected from everybody, doesn't necessarily mean when they come in your classroom tomorrow they would feel disconnected. So it's important that our teachers and administrators and parents know to carefully react to a child, and to be able to ask a child more than "are you okay?" but really to ask the child, so help me understand what you're feeling. Help me understand how we can help you. Is there something about your day that we need to know? And I think those are important conversations to have with kids. And it's important to remind our adults in a child situation how to respond to somebody who's being reactive or triggered by trauma.
Now, you've mentioned something, because now, okay, we're being made aware of what happens with people, adults or children, how to deal with it. But then there's something called the protective factors. So what are some of the protective factors that might be there to help? And what can people do about these things? You can't change your childhood, but how do you now you're a mom or a dad, how are you going to deal with this in a positive way?
So I think the protective factors for me are it reminds me of the 3 chords. One of the things that we have to keep in mind in education and in our human being relationships is relationships matter. The fact that we need to understand where a person is coming from, whether they're a child or an adult, and how they're interpreting their perspective of their situation at that moment is important. You can't do that in education if you don't have a relationship with somebody. And you haven't had a chance to sit down and really understand where that child or where that person is coming from. So being able to make those connections and having the 3 chords in your life of the whole mind, body, and spirit thing that really, really grounds us in taking care of our bodies and making sure the child is healthy and fed and well cared for there. Maybe that kiddo came to your school or your classroom starving or hungry, didn't get anything that day. Maybe they missed the morning breakfast at the school. They show up in your classroom and they're grumpy. Well, they might be hungry because they might be grumpy because they're hungry. The other part is that social emotional. They might just need a hug. Something might have happened at the house that they just need you to stop for just a minute, push the pause button, and ask them, is there something that I can do? Do you need a hug? A lot of teachers will have students, as they line up and come in the classroom, choose how they want to be greeted. Do you want a high five? And they point to what they want on the wall. Do you want a hug? And so they point to the arms with a hug. Do you want me to do a dance for you? And so that sense of humor really brings out a connection for kids. Relationships are so important for kids, so important for our adults that are working with kids as well. Making sure that we're connected, making sure that we see the whole child, the physical, the mental, and the emotional side of things, I think is super important.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. Anything else that you wanted to add about that? Because I think that's such a key thing. I loved all those steps about what a teacher can do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think relationships are the key. Yeah. They truly are. And then making sure, some of the other protective factors are making sure that people have concrete support in times of need. That breakfast if I didn't get it, or that referral to a mental health or a physical health provider is super important. And so that really just those supportive factors are super helpful. Any sort of connection, social connection. So again, those relationships, whether they're peer relationships, whether they're a mentor, whether it's a family member. But one of the biggest factors in resiliency is that an individual has at least one person that they can trust. And so part of going through these ACEs, going through these adverse childhood experiences, is that we don't trust the world. If we're experiencing physical abuse or sexual abuse, or we're witnessing something really scary, it breaks down this idea that I'm safe and that I can trust the people around me, that I can trust the world. And so having one adult, one person, one connection that an individual can trust can be really powerfully improving in resiliency. And so the idea that whether that's a teacher, whether that's an administrator, whether that's a peer, whether that's a counselor, or even if it's just not a very close relationship, even if it's just knowing that there's someone that's there consistently for me, and if I need to go to them, I can. Having that really does help people grow out. It builds, it grows, so that window of tolerance can shrink. When we have experiences that are really scary and we don't know how to handle them, our window of tolerance shrinks, and then everything becomes more stressful. But when we trust and we have positive experiences and we have positive relationships, that window can grow again. It's not an irreversible phenomenon. So the idea that there's someone that I trust, there's someone that cares about me, there's somebody that I can go to, that window starts to grow. And there's other ways to do that too, just some social emotional competence for children, for adults, to understand what their feelings are, to understand what they mean, and be able to feel them is super important. And so just knowing about what emotions are and how they're affecting me. Knowledge of parenting and child development. Mm-hmm. So if you're a parent or you're working with children or individuals that you fear may have several ACEs, may have several of these traumatic experiences, understanding how people develop, understanding how to build these relationships is really important. And so it really is about the protective factors are, again, those supportive relationships.
Well, that's very helpful. And now also, there are some steps that people can take, I understand. So I think there are 10 steps that you've mentioned that are very important. Can you tell us about those?
I'll talk about a few of them, and then Beth can fill in where I missed. How's that? One of the things that while Beth was talking came to mind is doing some self-care. I think people need to learn to trust society again and to trust those close relationships. But they also, when you've gone through traumatic experiences like this, you need to learn to trust yourself. And you need to learn that your judgment is okay. You need to learn how to filter out some of the pain and be able to make good decisions and have confidence in those decisions. That's where self-care comes in. Not beating yourself down when you make a mistake and go down the wrong path. Not forgetting that you matter. And that taking a breather, taking a walk outside, getting some air is important. So the self-care, I think, in the situations that I've seen with people is so important to make sure that you make time to take care of yourself. Another important factor is to be patient. So the journey for the accumulation of ACE in your life and trauma in your life and the window getting smaller took time. It was built brick by brick. And brick by brick, that wall also will be taken down. So you need to be patient with yourself, but also be patient with the people around you. The people that are helping you in this circumstance haven't been down this path before either. They don't know everything about your trauma. They expect you to react one way and you don't, and then it throws them off. So we have to be patient with ourselves and patient with people around us.
So we experience this trauma, and there could be social, there could be emotional, there could be physical consequences. And so it's important to remember that taking care of those different parts of ourselves can help build resiliency, can help us grow past the trauma as well. So, physical exercise, good sleep, good diet, we hear those things a lot and we go, yeah, but it really is important to remember that when we're taking care of our physical body, we're also taking care of our mental body and our spiritual and our social body as well. And so, physical exercise, there are lots of support groups. There are, getting actual help, getting help through a professional to help rewrite your story, to help stay anchored in the present, to help learn to be mindful and to do some meditation. There's lots to do, there's lots to learn just by Googling on the internet or by, asking around. But there are also mental health professionals and social service providers who this is what they do, is they help people understand the little steps that can really help an individual grow past what they've experienced.
Thank you. Any more of those steps there that you wanted to mention?
One of the things that came to mind here is just a reminder, another reminder is that there's not a prescription, and the journey is going to look quite crooked. The path that everybody takes is different, and you have to give yourself, when you're going through trauma like this, permission to not be okay, permission to sit in the corner one day and do nothing but cry, and that's okay. And we, as helpers or helpmates with these folks that are going through trauma, need to understand that on some days, a child who does nothing at school is still okay and still worth it, still valuable, still contributing to the classroom, and we're still helping them.
What percentage of students would you say have ACEs? I mean, is this a huge problem? Tell me more about that, because I think it's a bigger problem than we all think.
Well, I think this study originally was showing about, with the original group of people that Kaiser Permanente looked at, were 87% of people that they studied have one or more ACEs. But just because you have one or more doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to end up in some of these health situations or depression or any of the other lists. It just depends how you react to things.
So this is a huge problem, and I know you've given us a list of resources. Do you want to talk about any of those resources, any that you particularly go to at any one time? I know we use Search Institute and the 40 developmental assets. And what we've found is that other caring adults, that's one of the key things that we try to do at Wings for Life, is be that other caring adult for our folks, because it's so important for them to know that other people care. Yeah. And sometimes it can't come from the immediate family. Sometimes it has to come from the school, the classroom, the teacher, that caring person.
I agree.
Well, this has been so enlightening today. I want to thank all of you so much. This is wonderful for being our guest today on Wings on the Air. Hope everyone enjoys this show. I sure learned a lot, and thank you for all that you've given to us.
Wings on the Air is sponsored by Rainstar Capital Group.